2026 is already off to a bit of a rough start, but in an attempt to cling to some semblance of normalcy, we have a new product launching today. This is the AMD Ryzen 7 9850X3D CPU, purportedly the now fastest CPU for PC gaming in the world, which means I have busted out the test bed, run some benchmark tests for you guys, and long story short, yes, it is the fastest CPU for gaming now.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by the Paul's Hardware store on paulshardware.net, the only official source for Paul's Hardware merchandise, tantalizing t-shirts, brilliant beer sets, high-quality hoodies, and more, all featuring the classic thumbscrew for tasteful and refined viewers, or the 8-bit thumbscrew for tasteful and refined viewers who hate curves. New designs are added sporadically and at random, so head over to paulshardware.net and get some of that sweet, sweet merch right now. Or not right now, after you watch the video. Either way. So let's be clear on what the 9850X3D is. It is the 9800X3D with a 400 megahertz clock boost to its peak turbo frequency. That means it's going to boost up to 5.6 gigahertz now instead of 5.2 gigahertz, but in actual testing it goes to about 5.625 gigahertz. You get a little bonus there. But to be fair, the 9800X3D with its 5.2 gigahertz peak turbo speed actually runs at about 5.22. But let's step back and ask ourselves the very important question. Who might be interested in purchasing a 9850X3D right now in today's economy with memory prices and SSD prices, GPU prices super high? The 9850X3D's retail price is $500. Maybe that seems like a bargain compared to like certain memory kits or especially $1,000 plus GPUs that are on the market, but I think the price is actually one of the 9850X3D's sort of soft pros right out of the gate. The MSRP for the 9800X3D was $480. This is only representing a $20 MSRP bump. We're not sure yet if the 9800X3D is going to see any price cuts now that the 9850X3D is launching, but AMD does tell us that both are going to coexist on the market. The new one is not replacing the old one. Pricing aside though, my second question is of course going to be about performance. How much extra FPS are you going to get out of the 400 megahertz clock boost for the 9850X3D? I've tested 3 games at 3 different resolutions, and I've also tested 2 different graphics cards because AMD was saying you should see maybe a 3 to 5% performance boost, but that was with the 5090, and 5090s are going for $3,000, $4,000 plus these days, combined with the $500 MSRP of the 9850X3D. As you can see, the price of your gaming is getting pretty steep pretty quickly. My question was, are you getting any value out of the 9850X3D if you're running a slightly more reasonable graphics card like a 5070 Ti, which I chose because apparently Nvidia doesn't want to make those anymore? We're gonna have to wait till the end of the video to see those results. I'm just kidding. Here's the full compilation of all of my tests. Out of the 18 that were run, half of them showed no difference in performance at all, and you'll notice most of those are represented by the RTX 5070 Ti, meaning if you're not running an RTX 5090, you're gonna see less benefit out of the 9850X3D, and if you're running a higher resolution like 1440 or 4K, you're gonna see even less benefit because you're going to be more GPU limited than CPU limited, and the 9850X3D is definitely providing a boost only in those more CPU limited scenarios. And even then we're seeing a 1 to 3% performance boost, with the slight outlier being F1 2025 where we saw a 4 to 6% improvement for the new CPU. So there's a quick hit because I'm trying to respect your time, but there are more details to be covered. I have side-by-side testing that we're going to go into now, but first here's a quick look at my test bed specifications just so you know the hardware that we're working with. For GPUs I have the RTX 5090 Founders Edition, and then for the RTX 5070 Ti I'm using the Asus Prime model, running Windows 11 25H2 with everything up to date. And now let's look at those side-by-side benchmarks. All right, getting into the side-by-side comparison benchmarks, we're starting off with CyberPunk 2077, running the RTX 5090 at 4K. And here I want to note that the GPU frequency overlay display was not working correctly. That was locked at 600 megahertz the whole time because it was polling the integrated GPU's frequency rather than the discrete GPU, so just bear that in mind. The frame rate, or FPS average, and lows are pretty much the same for both CPUs here. This is going to be the trend for most of my 4K testing, where we are far more GPU limited than CPU limited, but do note the power and temperature differences between the two CPUs. We're drawing about 30 watts or so more power for the 9850X3D, and temperatures are also higher at about plus 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Switching over to 1440 resolution now, and in case you're wondering what software I'm using for the on-screen overlay here, it is called the TroyMetrics overlay. It is available directly on GitHub, and I've linked it in the description. So quick shout out to the developer, it looks really nice. Here the 9800X3D is trailing by about 1 to 2 frames per second, but note that the power and temperature differences between the two CPUs continue. I was noticing that the 9800X3D is pegged pretty consistently at 5.22 GHz, or more specifically 5.225, while the 9850X3D seems to dial back from its peak turbo frequency pretty constantly. And that trend continues here as we look at the 1080 results. To finish out the software I'm using, by the way, the data monitoring is being provided by Hardware Info 64, MSI Afterburner, and RTSS, or Riva Tuner Statistics Server. But at this resolution, the 9800X3D is now trailing by about 2 to 3 frames per second. But meanwhile, the 9850X3D's power has finally peaked over 100 watts because at 1080 resolution, the CPU is having to do more work to keep up with the GPU. And now we're switching GPUs to the RTX 5070 Ti back to 4K resolution. Here the frame rate is nearly identical between both CPUs. At 4K, the CPU has even less work to do when paired with a 5070 Ti, which has relatively less power. So the 9850X3D power and temperatures are lower, and its frequency is staying more consistently closer to 5.6 GHz. Here's 2560 by 1440 results. The frame rate is pretty much identical between both CPUs again. The 9850X3D power and temperatures are slightly increased versus 4K, since at this resolution there is a little bit more work for the CPU to do. And finally at 1920 by 1080, here the 9850X3D power and temperatures have increased again versus 1440, since again there is more work for the CPU to do at a lower resolution. But at least at 1080, the 9850X3D is actually helping out performance a little bit. The average for this run was 93 FPS for the 9850X3D, 2.2% faster than the 91 FPS for the 9800X3D. And now we're switching games over to F1 2025. Here we're back to the RTX 5090 at 4K resolution. I will note that the F1 2025 and RTX 5090 tests were the only ones that showed performance gains for the 9850X3D at all 3 resolutions. Even at 4K, there's a pretty consistent 5 frames per second lead for the 9850X3D. I noted that the frequency was more stable on this run as well, usually staying at about 5.6 to 5.62 GHz. And the win here at about 5.9% performance gain versus the 9800X3D was the best result out of all of my tests. Meanwhile, at 1440, the 9850X3D also stays ahead of the 9800X3D, overall 8 frames per second faster, which is actually slightly closer than the 4K result when you do the math. It is 5.1% faster versus 5.9% faster. And then we have the 1920 by 1080 results. Here the 9850X3D also wins, where it was 8 frames per second faster, which is actually a 4% win over the 9800X3D. I would have expected that the percentage win increase would have gotten bigger at lower resolutions, but it is possible that run-to-run variance is to blame here. Meanwhile, with the RTX 5070 Ti and going back to 4K resolution, things were a little bit more consistent. At 4K, it is clear that we are GPU limited, as both CPUs only managed to squeeze 43 frames per second out of the 5070 Ti, and the end result is that both tests are pretty much dead even. Meanwhile, at 2560 by 1440, playing F1 2025, it seems we're still GPU limited, although the lower resolution does get us more FPS. Both tests resulted in an 84 FPS average, and note that since I disabled DLSS features to focus on raw performance while testing, these systems can produce better frame rates than what you're seeing here with the aid of techniques such as supersampling. Lastly, at 1920 by 1080, the CPU finally makes a difference, and the 9850X3D pulls ahead by 4 frames per second, or a 3.15% advantage, which might make all the difference in the world to an actual F1 driver, but for gaming, it's a negligible improvement. Still, it's better than nothing. Our final title is Black Myth Wukong. Here we're back to the RTX 5090 running at 4K, and I'm also running the fixed benchmark run for consistency between tests. This was not one of the titles that AMD included in their pre-launch test results that they shared, as it is a very intense GPU workload game that only sometimes falls back on CPU performance. So with the 5090 at 4K, both setups tied at 30 frames per second. At 1440, the 9850X3D is able to make a difference, but only slightly, with a 2 FPS victory. Note that this is in contrast to the 5070 Ti test that we'll see in just a moment, though here we're seeing a 3.85% win for the newer CPU. And then at 1920 by 1080, the 9850X3D again earns a modest victory with a 2 FPS performance improvement. That's about a 2.5% win for the juiced up 8-core, but for this test it seems the only way the 9850X3D can help us is if the GPU is an overpowered RTX 5090. So now let's take a look at the 5070 Ti. So here at the 5070 Ti at 4K, it's pretty clear Black Myth Wukong is a GPU intensive title, as even with this setup, and the 5070 Ti is no slouch in terms of gaming, but we're only averaging a very choppy 15 FPS. Since the GPU is what's holding us back though, there is no benefit when paired with a faster CPU. At 1440, we see more of the same with a slightly less difficult to watch 29 FPS average for both the 9800X3D and 9850X3D. Also note that some of the on-screen capture footage that I'm showing you is noticeably choppier than it was in real-world viewing, so this test is not quite as unplayable as the footage makes it seem. And here's our final test at 1920 by 1080, with there being once again pretty much no difference between the two GPUs in this configuration. Oh, and in case you're wondering, this test footage was captured on a separate system, so while there is a bit of overhead for the on-screen display and monitoring apps I'm running, screen capture was taking place separately so as not to impact performance. So there you go, guys. Hopefully those side-by-side numbers were elucidating for you, even though sometimes it was like looking in a mirror with pretty much the same thing going on both sides. But now, the conclusion for the 9850X3D, starting with the pros for this new CPU. The price being only $20 more than its predecessor in a time when prices are going crazy does seem to be somewhat reasonable. There were a lot of people expecting that AMD would go for $550 or $600 for the price point, but I'm happy to see they didn't get too greedy there. It's also nice to see that out of the box you're getting boost frequencies up to 5.625 gigahertz, which gives you just a little bit of icing on the cake, given that the frequency is this CPU's main differentiator from the 9800X3D. And then I can definitely say that if you're looking for peak gaming performance right now, the 9850X3D is absolutely going to be the CPU to get, because it is faster than its predecessor, although that is only measurable in 2 to 3%, maybe a little bit more than that, increments depending on the game you're playing. And it's only especially most noticeable when you're in a CPU limited scenario like playing at a lower resolution, say 1080p. And that brings us to the cons for the 9850X3D, and the biggest one is that to get the most out of it, you really need the fastest GPU that's currently on the market, and that's the RTX 5090, and the 5090 costs ridiculous amounts of money. I think the cheapest ones were going for $3,500 to $4,000 recently, and that's a lot of money. A lot of people don't have a lot of money right now. And if you're playing with a slightly more modest graphics card like a 5070 Ti, you're not going to get much benefit out of this CPU, so you might as well save 20 bucks, I suppose, and go with the 9800X3D. The results in Black Myth Wukong, I think, were the most revealing in that regard, since it is a very GPU heavy game. The CPU didn't have any trouble keeping up, so there was no difference in the results between the 9850X3D and the 9800X3D. There's also a bit of a hit to thermals and efficiency, running at the higher frequency of 5.6 gigahertz or so. This wasn't universal across the board, but definitely for games that were leaning more heavily on the CPU, we saw power draw increase by 15 to 30 watts, and that also resulted in a temperature increase of about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius for the 9800X3D in the same scenario. But that is pretty much all that I have for you guys today on the 9850X3D. There are going to be other reviews going up, so I'm going to gather a few of those and link them in the video's description down below if you'd like to see some other takes on this new CPU from AMD. I've kind of gone back and forth between being bitter and cynical about the PC hardware situation and being like at least somewhat appreciative that there is something new launching for consumers this year, so I also have to give AMD a little bit of credit for that. I want to say thank you to AMD for sending this CPU over for review, and a big thank you to you guys for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and you want to hit the thumbs up button, that's greatly appreciated and it helps me out a lot. Also in the video description you can find links to the hardware that I use, as well as a link to my store at paulshardware.net, where you can buy shirts and mugs and pint glasses. It's a great way to help support my channel and get yourself some high quality merch. Thanks again for watching, guys. We'll see you all in the next one.